What I can't get behind, however, boy, it's time to talk about Breath of the Wild.
Oh,
Yay!
yeah.
And what is universally agreed to be pretty much the worst thing about Breath of the Wild?
The story.
Other than the story.
Weapon durability.
Other than weapon durability.
Rain.
The Legend of Rain at inconvenient times.
The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Rain.
But my god, the dungeons are so underwhelming in this game.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Look, okay. People who know me well, I don't know how much I've said about this publicly on YouTube, but I talk about it in my Discord fairly often. So if you know me, you probably know this, but any of you viewers who aren't in my Discord, join, by the way. But yeah, I have very mixed feelings about Breath of the Wild. I like it as a game. I really don't like it as a Zelda game. And the dungeons are a significant part of the reason why. They just don't feel like Zelda dungeons. They really don't. They're not awful, but none of them are really great, and they all kind of feel the same. I don't know, like, the build-up to the Divine Beasts, that's something I appreciate. Fighting the Divine Beasts themselves, those are cool. Those some of my favorite moments in Breath of the Wild. Easily.
Yeah.
And then you get inside them, and they all look identical.
I wouldn't necessarily say that, but similar.
They definitely, they're not identical, but they feel samey. To the point where they do blend together quite a bit. And honestly, the main 4 dungeons in the game, I barely remember at all. I don't remember hating any of them, but they're just not very good.
If I can just give my thoughts on pretty much all but one of them, Vana Rudania, and Vana Boris, I don't honestly remember much about them.
Yeah, same.
I don't remember hating them. I don't remember loving them, though.
I remember hating one, and you know which one I'm talking about.
Yeah, I remember things I liked about them, but overall,
they're very forgettable.
Kinda, yeah. The only one I really like is Vaughn Meadow.
So let's go ahead and get that one out of the way, because I agree with you. I agree that Vaughn Meadow is the best. But how good is it really compared to the rest of the series? That's what I'm really getting at here. Because, like, compared to Breath of the Wild, Vaughn Meadow is good. But if you want to compare it to, like, Ocarina, Twilight Princess, it's got nothing on them.
Yeah, honestly, even looking at the worst in giant air quotes, worst dungeon in Twilight Princess,
I still think I enjoy that more than any of the Divine Beasts.
Yeah, I would rather play Goron Mines or Lakebed Temple again before Meadow.
And I think just for that alone, we gotta put it in C, at the highest.
Yeah.
And it kind of hurts me to say that, because out of the 4, Vaughn Meadow is definitely the most interesting.
I would probably put it in B.
See, that's the thing. Look at what else is in B, and then think to yourself, given the choice, which would you take? That's what's keeping it at C for me. It's really thinking about, look at what you're putting it next to. Do you really think it's on the same level? I don't think so. It's not bad, but it just doesn't compare.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with the Divine Beasts for the most part. There are some of them have some problems, and I'll get to that in a bit. But other than feeling samey, there's not anything really negative that I have against any of them. It's just that when you put Breath of the Wild dungeons up next to Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword, Ocarina of Time, and Wind Waker, there's a clear winner. and it's not Breath of the Wild.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate. Because look, I really love this game, but as a Zelda game, it just doesn't do the thing. It just doesn't do it for me. And the dungeons are a shining example of that.
That's kind of a depressing note to end out on.
Yeah. Look, I want to put... honestly, I barely even remember their names. What is it? Varuda and Rudania is the fire one?
Rudania is the fire lizard.
I'm gonna put them in...
is the elephant.
I'm gonna put them in D. Because, again, they're not bad. Nothing really wrong with them. But Vamedo, I would argue, is better than both of them. So definitely a tier above. But they're not awful. They don't deserve F. They definitely do not deserve F. They're better than that. But there's nothing interesting to say here. All of the interesting things I could say have little to nothing to do with the dungeon. They're about how you get to the dungeon.
Kind of, yeah.
The dungeons themselves are just kinda bland. Which brings me to Vana Boris, which I will begrudgingly put in D. Because this is not a problem that I have against Vana Boris specifically. This is a problem I have against Breath of the Wild. And it has to do with the fact that it's open world, but the open world isn't really handled all that well. Because the game has no structure.
Well, it has a structure, it just has a very open structure.
There's a such thing as a game being too open. And Vana Boris is a good example of that, because, for context, I did this one second. Now, for those of you who are very familiar with Breath of the Wild, try to imagine doing Vana Boris blind, with like 5 or 6 hearts, tops, and almost no good weapons.
I'm so sorry.
It's not a pleasant experience. Vana Boris is very clearly, from a difficulty standpoint, designed to be the last one you do. If it is not, it is fucking irritating. Everything in here is way too strong. The boss especially, my god. Thunderblight Ganon is a pain in the ass if you are, like, underpowered. If you're equipped to handle it, it's actually a pretty cool boss fight. And I really like the idea of it. I like how you fight Thunderblight Ganon. But if you tackle it before you're quote-unquote intended to do it, it is extremely frustrating. And that is why I think Breath of the Wild is a poorly structured game. Because it's too open. It has a clear order that it wants you to do things, but it in no way nudges you toward them. It actively encourages you to fuck about in ways that are likely to screw you over. And this is a very clear example of that. Alright, let me explain, for context's sake, Varudania. You are never gonna do that thing first. And the reason that I think it's so unmemorable is because it's piss easy. And let's be real, you're not gonna stumble across the fire armor by accident. There is a good chance you will stumble across the other 3 just by kinda screwing around. And the fact that one of the ones that you're very likely to encounter early on, just from kinda messing around and exploring, is one of the hardest ones in the game. It's a huge difficulty spike. A massive difficulty spike that the game in no way warns you of, and kind of actively encourages you toward. And that's kind of not good game design. The problem with open world structures in games is that they have a significant effect on the difficulty curve of the game. And this can be one of 2 extremes. It can either be way too easy, and the game could have very little difficulty progression, or it could be like Breath of the Wild and have an intended difficulty progression, but is structured in such a way that doesn't support that difficulty progression at all. And that's why I don't really like that one, because I did it early on because the game made it seem like I should do it early on, when you're clearly not supposed to. If you do it last, you won't hate it as much as I did. But the game doesn't really do anything to discourage you from doing it early. Is there anything else you want to say?
No, I kind of see what you're saying,
But
but I don't really have much to add. I will add one thing. If Breath of the Wild 2 does an open world structure again, which I think they probably will,
most likely.
I hope that they have some sort of difficulty scaling for whatever they do with the dungeons. Like
Here's the weird thing, and I actually didn't know this until very recently. Breath of the Wild actually does have difficulty scaling.
Oh.
Believe it or not, it has a hidden experience system.
Oh.
That's why you encounter, like, silver bokoblins and shit later on, and not, like, in the first area. Because the Blood Moon thing, when it respawns all the enemies, it takes into consideration how many enemies you've defeated up until that point, and that determines, like, what tier of enemy is going to appear more often. I didn't know that until, like, 2 weeks ago.
But yeah, if they...
But the problem is that, while that is a decent-ish idea, there are still difficulty spikes in the overworld, don't get me wrong, so that doesn't completely excuse it. It doesn't make it marginally better, but it's still not handled all that well. The problem is that that doesn't apply to the dungeons at all.
Here's what I want Breath of the Wild 2 to do in regards to dungeons. What I want is have the game itself be open world, but have the story progression through dungeons either be linear or have their difficulty scale to your level. Like, kind of think Skyrim in a way. Like, there's a story that you can follow to the end, but you can say no to it and do whatever you want in between.
Yeah. And
like,
enemy difficulty scales in that game. As much as I don't like Skyrim personally, that is something it does better than Breath of the Wild, difficulty scaling.
And, if they did the dungeons, if they let you do them in order, but made it so that I don't know how this would be feasible to do, but if they could somehow implement it to where the puzzles and enemies change depending on what order you did the previous dungeons in,
that would actually be really cool.
I have no idea how that would be feasible.
I have an idea on how they would do that because I've played games that have different stuff like that. I know you haven't played this series, but the early Silent Hill games have 2 different difficulty settings. One for enemies, like one for combat, and one for puzzles.
Oh.
So a way that could be handled in a Zelda game is simply changing what difficulty your puzzle level is, depending on how much you've done already. It could be something that simple. So yeah, take inspiration from Silent Hill, of all things. But that would actually be pretty neat if they did something like that. That never occurred to me until you thought of it, but I think that's a pretty cool idea. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because we actually have 2 more to talk about here. Well, one more for you, 2 more for me.
Yeah, you have 2 more to talk about.
Because you have not done the Breath of the Wild DLC. Look, as much as I hate on the dungeons of Breath of the Wild, the final trial is actually damn good. B tier, I'm even thinking about maybe A.
Ooh.
Because this is what Vana Boris should have been. Basically, it's DLC. The game kind of expects you to have played the game at least a little bit before you commit to paying money for additional content. Why would you buy additional content blindly and then go into that before experiencing the bulk of the main game? The odds that you're going to do something like this before the rest of the game is extremely low, and if you are doing it first, there's a good chance you're doing it on purpose as part of some kind of personal challenge. Because let's be real, nobody does that. Nobody plays the DLC before the main game. That's just not a thing people do, normally.
No.
So, the difficulty scaling here, this is the hardest dungeon in the game by a significant margin. And it's warranted here, because you're actually not gonna do... there's no way in hell you're gonna do this one first. You have to go out of your way to not only purchase it with real-world money, which is a practice I'm not too fond of, but that's a discussion for another time. But you not only have to do that, but there is a complicated way of unlocking this place. It is a very long side quest, and you have to actively know what you're getting into. So by the time you get there, for as difficult as this place is, it deserves to be. This has some of the most mind-bending puzzles in the entirety of Breath of the Wild, harder than most of the shrines, harder than all of the Divine Beasts easily, and has, without question, the hardest boss in the game. Yeah, this place is what the Divine Beasts should have been. The puzzles are genuinely mind-bending, they're a lot more interesting. Basically, the idea of this place is that there's like 4 corners, and you have to solve each puzzle of the 4 corners before you can move on to, like, the final area where the boss is. Which is, it sounds very basic, but the puzzles individually in these rooms, they really make you think about Breath of the Wild's mechanics in a way that the majority of the main game doesn't. And it's actually genuinely kind of tricky to figure out. It actually is really good. And the dungeon alone is worth the DLC. So if you haven't gotten the Champion's Ballad, get it just for this dungeon. Everything else is a bonus, because this dungeon alone is worth that price tag. It's that good.
Strong words coming from you.
Yeah. Honestly, it's the best Divine Beast by far. Like, by a lot. There's not any one thing about it that makes it so good. It's just, it's what the rest of the Divine Beasts should have been. Genuinely well thought out puzzles, a genuine challenge at a point where you're expected to be capable of said challenge, and a worthy boss fight at the end. That's what I ask for in a Zelda dungeon, and this one delivers. So, does it compare to A and S tier? No, but it's a solid B.
Okay then.
Which brings us to the final dungeon in the series as of now. Hyrule Castle from Breath of the Wild.
Wouldn't the final trial technically be the final in terms of release order?
Release order, yes, but I think, like, canonically, Calamity Ganon isn't defeated when you do Champion's Ballad.
Okay.
But anyway, that's timeline discussion. We're not getting into that. What do you think of the dungeon itself?
I don't really have much thoughts on it other than it's epic, the build-up to fighting Calamity Ganon, but...
Here's the thing. Hyrule Castle in Breath of the Wild feels like a Zelda dungeon in a game without Zelda dungeons, if that makes any sense.
Really?
I would say so. Because here's the thing. Final dungeons in Zelda games already usually don't feel like the rest of the dungeons.
Uh-huh.
What they do usually feel like is something like what we got in Breath of the Wild. So even though it really isn't a traditional dungeon, it kind of feels like one just because of the fact that it's the last one and it's supposed to be different.
Huh.
And for that, I honestly think... I'm torn. I kind of want to put it between... It's either C or B. Because I do think that as a Zelda dungeon, the final trial is better. But if we're just judging the base game, Hyrule Castle is definitely better than the Divine Beasts. I think the theming is significantly better. I like the music a lot more. It's far more memorable. And the boss at the end, while I think the final phase of it is the most disappointing final boss in the entire series, and one of my most disappointing final bosses in any game ever, the Calamity Ganon phase is actually really cool. Best boss in the game.
Granted, that's not really saying much, but yeah.
It's not really saying much, but it's Breath of the Wild. It's
Take what you can get, I guess.
Yeah, if you go into it expecting a traditional Zelda game, it's just not. It's just not.
If you're going into it expecting a traditional Zelda game, What? Do you even know what this game is?
Yeah, like, that's why it's so hard to talk about Breath of the Wild when you're comparing it to the rest of the series. It's a perfectly fine game to talk about in its own right, because by itself, Breath of the Wild is an absolutely incredible game. And I really don't want to underplay that, because it is. It's a very well-made game, with its own set of strengths and weaknesses completely separate from the rest of the franchise.
Yeah.
But when you compare it to the rest of the franchise, it's just not the same.
It's one of those where you really have to look at it at its own thing.
Yeah, you really can't think of it as a Zelda game if you want to enjoy it. If you're a longtime fan of the Zelda series, it's kind of hard to enjoy this as Zelda as you know it. Is that a bad thing? No. But it's just not the same. As a game, Breath of the Wild is really good. It's just very difficult to compare. So yeah, kind of a weird note to end on, but that's pretty much our ranking. So we're looking at, what? Snow Peak Ruins, Arbiter's Grounds, Forest Temple, Earth Temple, Temple of Time, Palace of Twilight, Hyrule Castle, Ancient Cistern, and Sandship are all S tiers. And that's saying a lot.
We have a lot of S tier dungeons.
That's the thing, though. Those dungeons, in particular, they're the reason I love Zelda so much, and I'm sure this is true for you too, part of that is just because of how fun the dungeons are. Yeah. And the ones that stand out really stand out. When Zelda gets dungeons right, it gets them really right. And the spread here should really, really emphasize that. We have one F tier. That's it. And even if you were to consider our lists individually, there's still only one S tier or F tier each.
Yeah.
They're different ones, but if there's only one that each of us genuinely dislike, that says a lot about the quality of the series.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. And believe it or not, it's neither of our favorite series. Well, sort of.
Our favorite series is actually Metroid.
Sort of, for me. It's actually a tie between Zelda and Metroid. But it's very close. I flip-flop on them all the time, but I'm just gonna say it's a tie, just to make things easier. But yeah, we both love The Legend of Zelda. For as much as we may have bitched about it throughout this entire series, I guess, this is definitely not one video.
I think we're going to have a separate video for every game.
We might. I don't know. It depends when... I'll see how long it takes when we... At least a third of our time here has been talking about Twilight Princess.
Oh, yes.
Because we both have so many good things to say about that game.
Yes, we've been here for 4 hours now, and we've talked about Twilight Princess for over an hour.
Yeah, like an hour and a half at least was just Twilight Princess.
I'm sorry. I really love Twilight Princess.
Look, it's not even my favorite Zelda game, but I cannot deny how freaking good the dungeons in that game are. Like, it's not even close as to what Zelda game has the best dungeons. It's Twilight Princess, and it's by a landslide. It's not even a contest. And the fact that the ones outside of Twilight Princess are just so dang good really shows the quality of that game as a whole. And while it's not my favorite Zelda game as a whole, it has some problems. Those problems are not the dungeons, because goddamn they're good. So yeah, that's about all I gotta say. Is there anything else you want to add before I end this off?
What's something funny I could say to cap this off?
Fire Sanctuary doesn't need to exist, and would Skyward Sword be a better game if it didn't?
Yeah.
Okay, look. I get that it's probably not exactly a common opinion to be hating on the Fire Sanctuary so much, but let me put it this way. When have you ever heard anyone say anything good about the Fire Sanctuary? Or wait, let me one-up that. When was the last time you heard anyone say anything about the Fire Sanctuary? Just in general, at all.
I don't think I have.
Exactly. It's just the one that exists, has no reason to exist, and makes the game as a whole weaker. And it's the only dungeon in the entire series that I can genuinely say weakens the experience of the game as a whole. It's the only one. Even ones with significant problems like the Water Temple and, as much as I personally like it, Great Bay, Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time just wouldn't be the same games without them. With Skyward Sword, you can literally just cut this entire chapter and nothing would change.
Yeah.
So, yeah. We both like Zelda. That's about it. I've been Plant, that's been Snowheart. Later.
Well,